Today I'd like to share with you some learnings and gleanings I recently came across while reading the Science of the Sacrament. Now, one of the things that here in Église Gnostique that we've been criticized for is that we tend to see ourselves as a church of initiates. When somebody indicates an interest into joining the church, it's almost assumed they're going to begin the process of taking holy orders. And this makes sense, because if you're going to be a Gnostic, you got to be a Gnostic, you know? You've got to be on that pursuit of Gnosis. You just can't be congregation. You just can't be sitting there repeating liturgies. You have to become part of it all. So, but this has been, this has been a criticism for us. So recently, I had a need to go start delving back into my well-worn issue of Science of the Sacraments as I was contemplating the issue of whether or not virtual ordinations would be are valid. So without further ado, let me share my screen and launch into this. Let me go into our presentation mode. And there we go. So as I said, I had a need to delve back into the Science of the Sacraments, and I found a very interesting diagram that wasn't presented well. But the more I thought about it, the more contemplation I did on it, the more useful it became. So that's what I'm sharing now. And hopefully this will inspire those of you who are not fans of Science of the Sacrament, maybe give it another look. I know it can be a hard slog and one must persevere, but that's the price of these things. So other than that, you could wait for those of us who do have the patience for arcane things to add in. So this is the diagram in question. And this is in page 319 of the PDF I have. It's in the later version in page 364. But it's in the chapter on ordination. Now, this is the diagram I'm going to be going through in a form that's easier to see. And it's easy to skip over this when you're in Leadbeater's chapter on ordinations. First of all, this diagram actually has 10 different figures in it. And unfortunately, because of course Science of the Sacrament was originally published in 1920, the printing was not cheap. Doing diagrams and illustrations was not cheap, and it was and so it became an expensive thing. And I'm sure Leadbeater would have done this differently if money was not an object. So what this diagram actually goes through, and it goes through the ordinations in what energy centers of the individual are quickened at each of these stages of the ordination. And I've endeavored to make these a little bit more readable. So we'll just jump right in. So as I said, there was the diagram 11, which is what we're going to talk about today. and then followed by explanations of the individual ones at each point. Don't worry, I've got this all together so it's easier to see. A bit of an aside, these bases of the diagrams themselves are from the general theosophical model of the soul. This is right here on the left is the large scale, is representative of the large scale, what's called the 7 planes of mankind, 7 planes of the soul. And we can kind of see that this maps essentially into, these 3 map into the will activity. This would be will, wisdom activity, or activity wisdom here in the monadic plane. And then we have the intuition plane, higher mental, and emotional. There's various different ranks in this. A lot of I pulled up this one because it has the antakanara, which is the link between the personality and the soul. Here on this one, other diagrams will have the Igoa lotus, but don't worry, we're not going to go too much into theosophy more than we have to today. But I wanted to give this some sort of basic that this is where it's coming from. The theosophical model changes a little bit depending on who's presenting it, but this is the basics of it. For those completely unfamiliar with theosophy, Charles Leadbeater had been a member of the Theosophical Society for years before he moved away from that and into forming the Liberal Catholic Church in the 20s. The Theosophical Society model is essentially one of spiritual evolution. And so just in those words, you can kind of see how it fits with when we talk about being on the path of gnosis, of how do I lift myself up into higher and higher realms to possibly free myself from this world or to go into a better place, to become a more perfected individual. This is also what theosophy is about. Theosophy is about how do we pursue our spiritual evolution? And by pursuing our own spiritual evolution, by lifting ourselves up, we lift everyone up around us and everyone and the planet up as a whole. So that's the goal of theosophy in a nutshell. So let's launch into the first diagram here. This is, I want to move image here. So this is the first diagram, how Leadbeater starts. And he calls this the general status of the intelligent or cultural man. So this is the person who, has some has an idea that they have a soul. They've got some idea that there are higher realms above them. They maybe not have investigated them all that much, but they are aware that there are more than themselves, more than things beyond themselves. They study, they read, they're social commune with other people. So they're generally a well-rounded individual. And this is where he starts off with this with this point of like a base level person before the beginnings of the initiation process. I want to say a word here that generally in Gnosticism too, we start out with basically the same assumption, that the person entering into the clergy, entering into the sort of Gnostic pursuit, the Gnostic levels of increased awareness, basically has their stuff together. that they're well read, that they're fairly much, a functioning, as he says, intelligent, cultured person. So I mention this because there are systems that see initiation as being something to fix parts of you if parts of you are really broken. This happens in some of the Santorian-based systems where initiation is seen as the person needs to have a more direct communion with their Orisha in order to get their stuff together. That is not what we're talking about here. And so in this sort of initiatic pursuit in Gnosticism, in his book, he's talking about his pursuit of the clergy here. This is for spiritual evolution. This is not to fix psychological problems or such. not that we're necessarily free of those, but this is not to fix this. This is about you've already started to awaken these ideas, and you're basically fertile ground for it. You've done the work of straightening yourself up psychologically in previous lifetimes, and now you're ready to pursue this sort of spiritual discipline. So he starts in at ordination at the subdeacon level, subdeacon being the first of the major orders. Now, this is something to think about too, of so because he starts that these channels are awakened at the level of deacon, does that mean that they're not necessarily worked on to awaken in the minor orders? I think that's a good question. One reason why not might be because aside from the exorcists, which is something different, the other minor orders are often filled by just laity in the congregation or even children. We're all used to seeing, children as acolytes, or even children as assistants behind the altar, and that in some churches. So that a person may have some evolution and may be on the spiritual path through the minor orders, but that doesn't start the whole quickening process. So at the ordination of the subdeacon, what Leadbeater talks about as mainly as happening is that there's a quickening of the intelligence in the higher world, and then a strengthening of the bridge between the lower mind. We can think of this as the personality, and the upper mind, higher mind. Okay, what are these differences between this lower mind and the intelligence? One way to think about he has mind here as lower mental world, lower mental intelligence, it's just day-to-day activity. And even further below this, if you remember, the theosophical model was that of the astral, the emotional, and the physical realms. So when a person is working out of number 9, out of the regular low mental, it's just the day-to-day stuff. Your mind is just in autotron mode, thinking about things like sports scores, fashion, how many tries it took to get the Wordle today, those sorts of things. It's that sort of lower level. Meanwhile, the higher mental world, number 7 here, is the world of contemplation. It's the world of philosophy, abstract thought. It's a world of thinking about the big thoughts, thinking about issues of spirit and such. At least that's how it was understood and usually articulated around Leadbeater's time 100 years ago and in the early days of the Theosophy. What nobody foresaw at that time would be how this level is activated now in the last, 50, 60 years. And I'm speaking largely about how our sense of how the higher mental world has been activated by such disciplines as, well, we can think of things, of course, like theoretical physics and such, but also such, more tangible is like the world of software design. If you think about it, we even use the terms when one does software design, you're creating a user environment. You're essentially a bit of a demiurge, creating this little universe that whenever you're using a computer application, there's certain rules you have to, work within, certain things you have to manipulate if you want to get it working. There's certain things you had to do in order to bring up this video. And all of the tools you're using while you're watching this video have been created by one or more people who have had this sort of design of how this should work and how people should interact within it. A little bit of demiurge, Garden of Eden sort of thing, or, some sort of realm of Hades, depending on the software you're using. So anyway, the process of this sort of development of thinking and designing and building these really intangible sort of things, because in the end, it's all code, it's all bits and bytes, requires this sort of higher level of thinking. Intelligence here is probably maybe not the best word, but it's a higher level of mind that you have to do. It's almost working within the imaginary realms a bit. Of course, this is something too, during Leadbeater's time, we were just seeing the sort of beginning of the art, the sort of abstract art in that also used this sort of abstract ideas to bring about, workings and intelligence. And some of these abstract ideas of colors and that unconsciously have started to feed into software. Another area where this sort of mental work happens too, nowadays, which is new, is in this sort of collaboration we do. Global collaboration through these virtual systems, so that if I'm working on a project here in England, and I could be working with someone in the United States, working with somebody in India, and thinking about how their pieces of this, of whatever project I'm on, fits into another, and building things, imagining, Ravi in India doing one thing and Sarah in the US doing something else, and they're all kind of come together and converge. These sort of high-level planning that are all done within the world of conception is really starting to make use of this. And I think this is why, my own theory of why, this is why a lot of people, and even this also happens when you're doing like virtual gaming too. And you're thinking and interacting with people all over, or you're thinking and anticipating what they're doing worldwide too. So that's another level of this. But this is why we have the whole industry of people now working in this area. And we see a number of them. I've had a number of people come to me working in this area suddenly who are getting bursts of consciousness awakening, bursts of a kundalini, bursts of different sort of extended awareness coming in. And they're like, what is going on? And of course, they find us spiritual types, just Gnostic. We're like, oh, it sounds like you got a little bit of waking of consciousness going on there. And so that is how a kind of a collective evolution that's going on now. So that begins to awaken a bit more with the subdeacon. How does this work within like the Eucharist ceremony? It's largely that the subdeacon is often a bit of a helper or apprentice to the deacon himself. So they're mimicking that, and they're kind of learning the basics of what happens, not really, I don't say beyond the scenes, but on the different levels. What happens on the different spiritual levels within the Eucharist, within the Mass. So we have a little bit of the sense of awakening here going on with at the subdeacon level. The first ordination begins really with the deacon. And of course, we know the rules, the roles of the deacon is that while he or she doesn't consecrate the elements, she can distribute the elements. You know, he or she can distribute the elements. They can read from the Gospels. There is also the asperging that happens. And if we think about asperging, what happens when you asperge at different points? There's both a blessing of the elements, a blessing of the people. There's a bit of a cleansing, you know, kind of like a bit of a smudging going on there. And there's also creating this new environment, creating the spiritual environment, creating the sort of, you know, sensory activity that will help people propel into other planes. So the deacon, as Leadbeater points out, becomes a bit of a channel. This bridge here, that before we were showing as black, becomes enlivened. And this bridge is what's called the Rainbow Bridge, or Antakanara in Theosophy. It is the link between the higher mind, which is the beginning of the soul, and the personality. So we talk about the personality becoming soul infused, that the soul energy here begins to push down and quicken life. And as the person evolves, they no longer are responding in the more smart animal way of being a lower level personality. Here, they are becoming instructed by the soul. They're becoming instructed from the higher realms. And this is the bridge and that connection that is really quickened during the ordination of the deacon. And there is a recognition of this too. And this is why the higher mental plane here is darkened, because there is this recognition more of the person becoming the sort of soul-centered person, of also becoming a bit of having the bit of the Christ energy of recognizing the indwelling Christ and the Christ principle of love. And that also darkens this point, that the person is no longer just an animal man. We are becoming a soul-centered man or person. Also, one of the things that happens, a center that also is awakened, is number 5 here, during this time. And allows this, Leadbeater calls this the intuitional world. This is also what we might call, what Henry Corbin calls the imaginary world. Terresta imaginalis. This is the world, a world where things really happen, where what happens beyond just this physical realm of what's going on. So the deacon begins to see and recognize they are now up at the altar as elements are being consecrated. If they have any sort of innate intuition already, they may feel the changes in power during the different parts of the Mass. And they may even see things going on beside the Mass, begin to see things from within these sort of psychic realms. In this intuitional world, during the first laying of hands, as during the priest, becomes more enlivened, as does the priest's connection, of course, with within the Trinity, this is the Christ consciousness. And we can see the direct line that the individual during the first layer of hands, in the first part of the priesthood, during the ordination, they become more infused with Christ's energy. As the ordination says, you're forever a priest of the order of Melchizedek, that eternal priest. And that sort of awareness of being, not only just awareness of being Christ's energy, because we're talking about more of awareness, there is a gnosis there of the indwelling Christ energy, the indwelling love wisdom. That's another name for this part of the spiritual realm. The indwelling love wisdom that is there and becomes enacted within the actions of the intuitional world by the priest. During the second layer of hands, we see this level of the intuition world, of the imaginary world, also being active. So if we think this is the path of Christ's energy, then this is the path of the Holy Spirit. Now, I wanted to talk a little bit about the imaginal world. If you read Signs of the Sacrament, one of the things that Leadbeater discusses is how during the Mass energy is raised. At what point does a protective bubble of spiritual energy start forming around the altar among the congregation? At what point does this become somewhat of a shape? He shows a shape like the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, but a shape going up into the spirit realm. At what time does the angel of the presence of the angel Eucharist appear? At what point does the floor, maybe if it's a tessellate floor, reach down to the bottom, reach up to the top? This is all seeing these things happening in your mind's eye, as we would say, while doing the Mass. This place where this happens is in the imaginal world, is in what he calls the world of the intuition. And working there, rather than in a physical, that being just stuck in the midst of it, takes the whole ceremony to another level. Now, we might think about this with different initiations, or, for example, or maybe just say you're working in a home home church environment. In your mind, you could be in some sort of Egyptian temple. You might be in a cathedral, you might be in a Hagia Sophia. It's how do you, in your mind, create that world around you. The Rosicrucians talk about being in the celestial temple, the seven-sided celestial temple at all. These images are more than just fantasy images. Through practice, they become landscapes where we can move and act. And as one goes back into the same image again and again. All right. Sorry for that interruption. I was talking about the imaginal world, this world of intuition. And this is really what is quickened at this point in the time. So part of the idea that the priest behind the scenes, you know, as the priest is doing the Eucharist, or this goes as well for the Venerable Master during a Masonic ceremony, any leader during any sort of ceremony, while they're doing one action in this world, there is another world action that's going on in the more glorified, perfect, imaginal world behind the scenes. And that is what happens in this place. Another good example of this comes to mind is Teresa of Avila talks about the interior castle, or St. John of the Cross, you know, the Carmelites in general, they talk about the mountain of Carmel, being on Mount Carmel. So these are imaginal worlds where things exist in a lot more glory than that. As one spends more time in these worlds, as we spend more time in Mount Carmel, Mount Tabor, you know, wherever, in the celestial temple of the Rosicrucians, it strengthens our own personal intuition. It's as if we're working in a psychic realm where we can, again, be able to perceive and pick up things from a human level that's beyond. It's a layer where wisdom happens. And that's why it makes sense that there's this connection between the spiritual, the triple spirit, where we have the Trinity of the Christ, which is wisdom also. It's called love wisdom, ray number 2 in the rayology. Again, more theosophy speak. But this is the sphere of love wisdom. And that it also starts radiating out the more time and the more developed we become to working within this imaginal world. Of course, one other thing that happens as this is quickened, that this higher level of the personality and being a soul-infused personality becomes strengthened. One of the things I like about Leadbeater's diagrams here is he also talks about what more can be done at this sort of level of ordination. And here he talks about, this is figure 6, is the developed priest. So working with what was done before, there is further development that can be done on the imaginal world, especially on this sort of, I think of number 6 as like the connective world, the These are different elements of the Christ consciousness sound. But this is the element also of our connectivity to other people. This are the level of love that's expressed as compassion, sympathy for others, and that this also grows. So it develops then this sort of tenderness that can be done. There is also, over time, the more one does the Eucharist or one more does the ceremony, you build up the connection with the intuitive world. You build on the connection to what is happening behind the scenes. You become more more sensitive to the power as it raises at different parts of the ceremony. And not only do you become more sensitive to how the power is raised up, but you also become more of an active agent. And I think this is where these circles become more enlivened. They become more cricket in that, because you are also be part of the channel, the vector to pull things down. At the level of concentration, these elements have become active in a new way. Number 4 here is really that of active intelligence, the Holy Spirit, we can think of it. And during the initial stages of the consecration of the bishop, that becomes further active center. Also, as the individual too, their previous connection between their soul-centered personality and the Christ Spirit becomes emboldened in a new way. There is the power that's come down then in the consecration of being able to consecrate others through the spiritual realm. And then within the anointing of the bishop, we have the third part of the Trinity, which is actually, of course, the first part of the Trinity, which is actually is will or the Father becoming enlarged. And there is this connection then between all 3 Trinity elements, as well as a very strong connection of the power itself through the Holy Spirit, that sort of Pentecostal power coming down, that the bishop as an individual can start pulling down this energy and this work. So, and it is this sort of active pulling down when needed as a power of the bishop that distinguishes a lot of the bishop power from that of the priest in this sort of ordinational model. Let's put it that way. But we are talking about how does these different, as we're talking about this story, different ordinations, we get the different centers are being activated. And of course, as the bishop also, in the same way with flexing the muscles as in the previous situation, as the bishop practices these spiritual muscles, we see this sort of connection happening and enlivenment of all 6 of these human spiritual realms section being altered. So at this point, Leadbeater becomes very poetic. He says the development of the ideal bishop is possible to one who takes advantage of every opportunity. All his principles become responsive to the channels of power and love of Christ. He becomes a verbal son of spiritual energy and blessing. So we see how things are brought down. And the final stage, which of course goes beyond bishop, it really gets into the level of discipleship initiate, and that of the perfected man. We see ablaze each of the centers. And as Leadbeater, and the rainbow center also ablaze the goal. And as Leadbeater says, the perfect man is now linked up with Christ and his higher self, but he comes more and more in epiphany of the Logos and the deity who brought forth the solar system. And of course, he becomes the master whose incarnation is no longer necessary. In Buddha speak, at this point, he's the Buddha, the Bodhisattva. These are all there. It would be interesting to see this same sort of channel math of like how when in Theosophy, as they talk about discipleship and initiation, how this flows through. But anyway, I hope this has kind of given you a little bit of thought about how different channels of the personality, different channels of the soul, different energy centers can be enlivened at different points with initiation, ordination, and I think this gives a lot of justification to the idea that initiation and ordination are really one in the same. So I'll leave you with a few thoughts to contemplate. One, of course, your own experience of ordination, initiation. How, have there been times when or even when you, in the process of being ordained or initiated, where you've really felt these different energies being summoned? Or if you've done any initiations, ordinations, where you felt these sort of power going in, or people or the candidate reacting with a change from based on the experience. Has there been times when you felt this is more meaningful than others? And I also think what I really, really liked about these diagrams is this idea of how they become a bit of a blueprint for spiritual growth and expansion post-ordination. That, of course, as Gnostics, we know you just can't sit there on your laurels thinking you've actually done something, and one needs to continue the pursuit of gnosis, the pursuit of perfection. And that's really what Leadbeater is talking about and expresses in these diagrams. So I hope this has been helpful and interesting. Again, if you haven't looked at the Science of the Sacraments or don't own a copy, I'd recommend going out there and getting one. The older ones are better. There was a time during the 80s and 90s where getting a decent copy was hard. And there's a lot of transcripts out there that really don't do justice to some of the pictures. The very early versions had more color, color images, and just, one or two or three. There's no more than, I think there's 3 in the first one. I have a 4th printing in from 1940 that there's, I think, 1 of them in. But something to consider if you don't want to go that way or prefer things electronic. The PDF is available online, number of different sources. I just put one here as is convenient, but there's a lot of PDFs out there if you want to do it for free. So